Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Grover Cleveland, and the focus is Reform President. The year is 1885, it's March 4th, Inauguration Day, and Cleveland joins the outgoing President Chester Arthur in the carriage ride from the White House to the Capitol, time for the transfer of power, takes his oath of office, gives his inaugural address, a conservative address focusing on the limited role of the federal government, respect for the separation of duties between the different branches of government, his role in his mind of safeguarding the public purse, not spending excess taxpayer dollars unless absolutely necessary. As for foreign affairs, it was completely new territory for Grover Cleveland, so what did he do? He hearkened back to the beginning and the views of President George Washington, the first president of the United States, who took a position largely of neutrality when it came to foreign affairs. Good enough for Washington, that approach was good enough for Grover Cleveland. The hallmark of Cleveland's campaign had been reform, including civil service reform, which he believed was still under direct attack of partisan influence and something he was bound to stop. According to Cleveland, our citizens have the right to protection from the incompetency of public employees who hold their places solely as the reward of partisan service, and from the corrupting influence of those who promise and the vicious methods of those who expect such rewards. Don't expect them under the watch of Grover Cleveland. After the ceremonies at the Capitol, people returned to the White House, where Cleveland oversaw the parade in front of the White House. There was the inaugural ball that night, a nice festive evening. Probably weren't going to be that many social events like that at this particular White House. Grover Cleveland's idea of fun wasn't a dinner party. It was going out with the boys at all hours of the night to saloons and drinking beer and singing and playing cards. Not exactly the kind of forums typically had for social events at the White House, but Cleveland would have some help in the White House. His sister Rose came in to be the White House hostess, and she was well educated, a great conversationalist, and really was actually highly opinionated on topics. He really enjoyed engaging with the political class, but still not exactly the social affairs that other presidents had done would be seen under the watch of Grover Cleveland, at least in this first term. Brought a couple of other people with him from Albany, New York, from the governor's office. He brought his personal servant, William Sinclair, who would take the role of White House steward, and of course Daniel Lamont, his right-hand man, personal secretary in Albany as the governor, now personal secretary in Washington with the president. The last Democrat elected to the presidency had left office about a quarter of a century before. This was James Buchanan, and before the Civil War. And now the Democrats were anxious to reap the rewards of finally getting back control of the executive branch. That meant patronage, it meant jobs. There were 126,000 positions in the federal workforce at the time, and only 16,000 of them were covered by the protections in the recently passed Pendleton Act. Under Chester Arthur, Cleveland's predecessor, the first meaningful civil service reform was started in this Pendleton Act, but it still only covered less than 10% of the workforce. And the Democrats were anxious to go for wholesale removals from President Cleveland. Get rid of all these Republicans who have these jobs, give them to your supporters and Democratic supporters from around the country. That was not going to be the case under Grover Cleveland. Despite the pressure to do so, he believed in a stable civil service. He did not believe in widespread removals, and even though he saw job seekers incessantly coming after him day after day, it wasn't really going to change his mind. According to Cleveland, I go to bed after a long day with the feeling that I must be the meanest man in the world, for I seem to say only no, where I would be only glad to say yes. But this office seeking is a disease. I am entirely satisfied of that. It is even catching. Men get it and they lose the proper balance of their minds. These first couple of years would be the worst of these incessant office seekers coming at Grover Cleveland. Now, in the short term, Congress was out of session, typical at the beginning of a presidential term at this time, but that didn't stop Cleveland from jumping into his reform agenda. And this wasn't just about reform of the civil service. According to Cleveland, good government is the main thing to be aimed at. Civil service reform is but a means to that end. The reform, a lot of it kicked off with the Navy Secretary, William Whitney, who was off to modernize the U.S. Navy, which is actually, again, started under President Arthur, and his predecessor got a few new ships made of steel propelled by steam. This was part of the modern U.S. Navy just beginning, and William Whitney picked up and continued to push Congress for more ships, more dedication to a modern Navy to try to catch up with the rest of the world. He also focused on some service-wide reorganization efforts to try to cut the bloated staffs that had built up in the Navy over time, and also have things just be more economical and more efficient while also building the modern Navy at the same time. The Interior Secretary Lucius Lamar took on reform in the Western Territory. And in the West, the government had been giving vast tracts of lands to companies as incentives to start building both infrastructure, businesses out in the West. But the problem was, as Lamar and Cleveland concluded, they had given too much. And now there were these vast lands that were just sitting idle, unavailable for individual settlers, but not being used by these corporations to take advantage of the largesse of the government in the past. And so what did Lamar do? He started suspending pending grants. They'd given out enough of these. They didn't give out any more, but then they went further. They deemed many of the existing agreements non-compliant on the side of these corporations. They weren't using the land, so let's take it back. And the Cleveland administration clawed back some 81 million acres during this term in office, so they could do with it, instead of sitting there doing nothing for corporations, they could now have an opportunity to engage the individual citizenry and give them some opportunity with some of this land. There was another area of attempted reform on behalf of the Cleveland administration. Didn't go very far, and this was in Indian relations. And Cleveland had a policy with a slogan attached: civilization, citizenship, and assimilation. That was the mantra of Cleveland's efforts toward the Indian community, and he tried in his mind to educate the Indians, to teach them English, to drive them to more assimilate with the Western culture. And he even had his commanding general, Phil Sheridan, go out and find areas where ranchers had taken some Indian land, basically poached it. He was kicking them off to try to free up this land for Indians, but he really wanted to focus on bringing them into the culture of the United States. That was part of this plan of civilization, citizenship, and assimilation, and it did not go very well. There was an opportunity, and actually a well-meaning law that was passed, the Dawes Severalty Act, that was pushed forward by a senator by the name of Henry Dawes, and it was well-intentioned to provide land to individual Indians. But it was not going to their tribes, it was going to the individual Indians, 160 acres, and it came with a path to U.S. citizenship. But there were strict terms attached to the Dawes Severalty Act. If you took that land and you took that opportunity to become a U.S. citizen, you were required to assimilate. You had to live apart from the tribe. You had to learn English. You basically had to change from being hunters to farmers. And again, this was a complete misread of the vast majority of the Indian culture, because it was that Indian culture was more important to the Indians than any of these other opportunities that the U.S. government was providing. And so they did not engage. They did not take advantage of this 160 acres that was being offered them under the Dawes Severalty Act. And that's where things really backfired, because there was an element in that act that said if there were lands that were set aside that were not claimed, the government could repurpose those lands. What did that mean? Sale to the white man. And that's pretty much what happened. Over the next 50 years, the amount of land associated with the Indians went from about 138 million acres down to 50 million acres, a dramatic reduction in large part because the Indians were not interested in putting their culture aside to move forward in plans like Cleveland's or other successive presidents to try to assimilate along those lines. So the Dawes Severalty Act actually caused a lot more harm than good in the affairs of the Indian relations. What about the other race, black race? There were little in the record of civil rights in terms of the Cleveland administration. Now, his view of this was basically, again, a states' rights, limited role of the federal government. If there were black codes and discrimination and second-class citizen status going on for blacks, principally in the South, which was certainly happening at the time of Cleveland's presidency, it was outside his purview. That was up to the states. So very little happened in the area of civil rights under the watchful eye of Grover Cleveland. Interesting relationship for Cleveland with the civil rights leader Frederick Douglass. completely different politically, but Douglas actually respected Cleveland personally. He said that we were in politics separated from each other by a space ocean wide. Nevertheless, I found him a robust, manly man, one having the courage to act upon his convictions and to bear with equanimity the reproaches of those who differed from him, which won my respect for the courage of Mr. Cleveland. That really defines Cleveland to a T. Douglas also probably appreciated the fact that he did not remove Douglas from his role as the recorder of deeds for the District of Columbia, which was a political position that had been given to him in the previous administration, and Cleveland allowed him to finish his term there, and he also invited Douglas to a bunch of events at the White House, which was uncommon for Douglas based on who was in the White House at times, and so he appreciated and respected Cleveland personally. Didn't get much out of him, though, of course, in the area of civil rights during his term in office. Well, Congress came back in December of 1885, and there was immediate conflict with Grover Cleveland. Now, even though he didn't make many changes in the civil service, there were a few hundred positions that he was ready to transition out, mostly for cause, either incompetence or perhaps overly partisanship, which was also to be offensive and not permitted in the civil service. And so there were a few hundred removals that Cleveland was planning to do, but he had this thing called the Tenure of Office Act that was still technically in place. It had been passed a couple of decades before when Congress and Andrew Johnson, the president, were really at each other, and it basically said that the president could not remove a Senate-confirmed official without the Senate's okay. When Ulysses Grant came into office, and by the early 1870s, this had been largely neutered because Grant wasn't going to go along, and most of the provisions were withdrawn, including the one that said that the president had to give Congress the reason for removals. Well, now in 1885 and into 1886, Congress was trying to put itself back in a position of posture with the administration. It was saying, look, you want to do these removals? Well, we're going to consider them. You send us your reasons, and we'll tell you what we think. Well, Cleveland was saying no to this. Look, that provision in the law was gone. You don't have any authority. This is separation of powers. I'm not going to play this game. In fact, he said that my duty to the chief magistrate, which I must preserve unimpaired in all its dignity and vigor, would compel me to refuse compliance with these demands for these documents. He was claiming executive privilege, refusing to share this information about removals. Congress, in the meantime, was refusing to do confirmations of the new people. So who was going to blink in this stare down? And in this case, it was Congress. The law and the principle really had shifted to the side of the president on this topic. Eventually, Congress kind of realized it, and the Senate decided to stop making these requests for the removal information, and they started doing the approvals of the nominations. And so this was an area where Grover Cleveland saw something in black and white terms. He wasn't about to compromise, which was consistent with his pattern throughout his political career. And in this case, he won out, prevailing in the end. Didn't really care if there were political consequences because that's not the way Cleveland operated. And in this case, he ended up being successful in his stare down with the U.S. Senate. Labor relations was another topic that Cleveland had to get involved in. And in the past, oftentimes the executive branch believed that labor fights really were not the purview of the federal government. But when it did get into the fact of labor versus management, executive branch and the judicial branch tend to decide with management. The workers really didn't have a lot of political power. And frankly, in this era of industrialization where the management was doing extremely well, in part because there were way too many workers who were willing to work for relatively low salaries, that meant little protections, not very good conditions, and the workers were starting to get increasingly upset. By 1886, this is the middle of the Gilded Age where, again, the rich are getting richer and the poor not having a fair shake, not having any security in their positions, and the strikes started to come. In 1886, there were more strikes in the U.S. federal government than in any year before. But largely, Cleveland and his administration stayed out of this. They did not believe it was the role of the federal government. Until something happened. A catastrophe happened in Chicago at the Haymarket Square where there was a rally during a strike in which a bomb went off. 7 police officers were killed. 50 more people were wounded at Haymarket Square. They never found the actual bomber who ignited the violence, but there were a number of anarchists who had put some publications out prior to the Haymarket Square rally that indicated an encouragement of violence. Because of that, they were tried, they were convicted, and 4 members of this anarchist group were actually hanged. Where did Grover Cleveland stand on this? Well, he believed the time was right, that somebody had to pay the interest of labor. Wasn't just going to side with management, which has typically been in the past, and he sent a message to Congress to this effect when he said the value of labor as an element of national prosperity should be distinctly recognized, and the welfare of the laboring man should be regarded as especially entitled to legislative care. No president had ever said that before. Cleveland warned that corporations, which should be carefully restrained creatures of the law and servants of the people, are fast becoming the people's masters. He didn't think that was right. He wanted to increase to the size of the Labor Bureau, and he pushed for the right for federal mediation or arbitration when it came to trying to resolve some of these strikes. And in fact, by the end of his first term, Congress did pass a law that allowed for voluntary federal arbitration in the case of railroad strikes. It was a step in the right direction, still a lot of work to go in this, but Grover Cleveland, really the first president to pivot on the side of labor in terms of these labor management issues. First couple of years for Grover Cleveland's presidency were hard. Reform was hard. He was bucking the trend in a number of different areas. He and Lamont were up every night, going over in excruciating detail every aspect of the federal government, and he hadn't even touched on some of the most controversial issues: the currency, the tariff. Those are topics for another day. That is Grover Cleveland and Reform President from the life of Grover Cleveland. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.